That Bernard Hogan-Howe has today issued a public apology to Lord Bramall, Lady Britton and Harvey Proctor, which will be welcomed by some of the relatives involved there. There's criticism from other quarters suggesting it's an interesting day to release this particular report, given what's happening in America and the focus of media attention away from this story in a different direction.
Yes, we're going to get a chance to talk to the Commissioner in the next hour or so, and clearly that's an issue. The timing of this is something that has been condemned by those who were suspects in this investigation and the relatives of those who were suspects who have since died. But of course there are lots of issues for the Commissioner to talk about in the next hour or so. I should say at the outset that Sir Richard Henriques' report does not criticise the Commissioner personally, but he has said in a statement that accompanies this report that he's dismayed at Sir Richard's findings. Sir Richard does say at the start that it was essential for the Metropolitan Police to investigate the allegations, particularly as they involved allegations of the murder of 3 children. But he does go on to find 43 principal failings of this investigation. The Commissioner, as I said, describes his reaction as dismay at the report's findings. The other headlines I can tell you are that the man who made the original allegations, whose identity we don't know but has always been referred to as Nick, is, we understand, being investigated by an outside force for attempting to pervert the course of justice, and 5 officers from the Metropolitan Police have been referred by the force to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, and that includes, well, the ranks are from Detective Sergeant up to Deputy Assistant Commissioner. 5 officers involved in this investigation are being referred to the Independent Police Complaints Commission for alleged breaches of the force's code of professional standards. Let me just give you a flavour of those 43 principal failings that Sir Richard Henriques found in his report. Principally, he said that the decision to end the investigation should have been taken much earlier. Remember that in all this investigation there were no charges brought and nobody was arrested. It should have been wrapped up much earlier than it was, according to the report. The force was wrong to believe the one complainant, the so-called Nick, at the outset, wrong to believe him. He was interviewed by officers who knew nothing of his past. He'd written blogs, he'd been interviewed over previous complaints that had gone nowhere. The officers who interviewed him in this investigation did not refer to Nick's past. There was an infamous statement by one of the officers involved who said this: "We believe what Nick is saying is credible and true." Well, that should never have been said. The officers should not have said that they believed exactly what the complainant was saying. One other thing, Sir Richard says that in some cases there were no grounds for some of the house searches of the suspects that were carried out. Property was seized in some of those searches, property that wasn't covered by the terms of the warrant. And also the force is accused by Sir Richard Henriques of helping the media identify some of those suspects, including Lord Bramall, Lady Britton, who by this, her husband Lord Britton had by this stage died, and the other principal suspect in this investigation, the former MP Harvey Proctor. So that's given you a brief outline of what's in this report. Lots of questions for the Commissioner, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, to answer in a round of interviews he's going to be doing in the next hour or so.
It will make for interesting listening. Martin, thanks very much indeed.
Now, just to give you some idea of what that means, the Met's policy is that should we learn about something like this, a person being arrested or their home search, the Met will listen to what we know and may confirm some police activity related to a certain area of the country. Now, that doesn't identify the person arrested, but does give a clue. It does lead to people being legally, but certainly named in the media. Now, Sir Richard is saying that should not happen. He goes further than that. He says that suspects of sexual abuse cases like this should have anonymity from the point that they are arrested. So that is a clear change that he's calling for, something that would need legislation. He has raised the pressure for that legislation to be passed. Worth pointing out that those making the allegations do have anonymity. So there's a whole range of important points being made by Sir Richard here in a report that is redacted. It's got quite a lot of black marks like that, you can see, to hide details from the investigation. It's not the whole report. The Met have been criticised for putting out this summary of what he's found, but it is highly significant and, as you say, highly damning.
Yeah, I mean, devastating, really, Tom. I think we can just show, actually, on the screen the Met Police Twitter feed at the moment, which is carrying some very profuse apologies from the Commissioner. Just put this into a wider context for us in terms of Scotland Yard, the Commissioner going early, we know that. Also accusations that they're effectively trying to bury bad news by coming out with this just at the time of the American elections, when it may not feature so prominently in the newspapers tomorrow.
That is certainly the allegation. I mean, let's start with that. That's the allegation. I have got no proof that the police decided to put this out today, but the effect of it is that tomorrow's headlines, front pages, are likely to be about what's happening across the pond rather than what's happening here in South London. So that's the first point. Interestingly, there is no sign that I've seen in a report that I've only had a certain amount of time to read of direct criticism of Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe himself. Now, he has said he will end his job as running the Met, as the Commissioner of the Met, Britain's most senior police officer, somewhat earlier than expected, and some thought it might be linked to this. Well, he's not criticised in this report. Somebody who is, in a way, criticised, there is a national child abuse investigation team called Operation Hydrant that is collating all reports and investigations into child abuse in the past, many of them involving prominent people locally and nationally. And this report takes issue with a number of the views that are held by that investigation and by its head, Simon Bailey. In particular, the view that complainants, as Sir Richard would much rather have them described rather than victims or alleged victims, that they should be believed throughout the investigation. And that's a significant piece of friction between the big investigation coordinating all this work nationally and the man who's been asked to put this report together. And so, again, I can't really stress the significance of all this.
And again, Tom, this isn't really the end of the matter, is it? Because as you mentioned, you know, the Met have said that a complainant from Operation Midland is being investigated for attempting to pervert the course of justice, and we've got 5 officers referred to the Independent Police Complaints Commission. So the publication of this report doesn't draw a line under things.
That's right. I mean, the police have said about Operation Midland in the past, in answer to a number of questions about should Nick, the man at the centre of this, be investigated for perverting the course of justice, that they don't do that, that they hadn't found evidence that he had lied and that they would not be investigating him. Now, all we have from this report, or rather from the statement the Met made in response to it, is that an individual was being investigated by Northumbria Police, an outside force away from the Metropolitan Police, and that person, of course, is not named. Now, obviously, we will seek to get some clarity on that, but that's all the police have said at this stage. And as you say, a number of officers, 5 officers from Operation Midland, referred to the IPCC, and I can tell you those are officers of senior rank, and it looks to me there are no names given, as you'd expect in a report that says that those accused should not be named, but it looks to me like that is some senior people directly involved in the running of Operation Midland. And a second operation, you'll remember that Lord Leon Britton was accused of rape by a woman back in the past, and that there was an investigation into that, Operation Vincenti. That also has been referred to the IPCC. So as you say, this has got some way to go yet.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. Tom Simons there, our Home Affairs correspondent, who's been reading that independent report.
Yes, and we're just seeing a lengthy statement from Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe in which he talks about some of the 43 failings identified in Operation Midland, some of which Tom Simons referred to, for example, to believe the complainant Nick was a credible person for too long, to obtain search warrants with flawed and incomplete information. And Sir Bernard says, "I am today issuing a public apology to Lord Bramall, Lady Britton and Harvey Proctor for the intrusion into their homes and the impact of Operation Midland on their lives. The public identification of suspects compounded the harm of our investigative failures," he says. "They have all suffered as a result of the investigation and our description of the allegations as credible and true."
Yeah, he goes on to say, "We should have tested the credibility of the complainant more rigorously before conducting the searches. I fully recognise that Mr Proctor, Lord Britton and Lord Bramall are innocent of the offences of which they were accused of by the Operation Midland complainant. That investigation found no credible evidence against any of the suspects." And Sir Bernard also says it's a matter of professional and personal dismay that the suspects in the investigation were pursued for so long when it could have been concluded much earlier. All of that is on the Met Police Twitter feed with details of the Commissioner's pretty abject apology, really, in the wake of this report.
Just a little bit of context. He talks about Operation U-Tree, which that operation led to many convictions. That was at a time when there was significant concern that numerous sexual attacks on children and others had been ignored, including by the Metropolitan Police in decades gone by. So he attempts to put a little bit of context into all of this and the climate, if you like, at the time that Operation Midland began. But profuse apologies there from the Met Commissioner, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe.
Yeah, it's interesting. He says he doesn't expect the sympathy of the suspects, the former suspects in these cases, but he does believe that it's necessary to understand the pressure on the Met's investigators at the time. So more on that as it comes into us here at BBC News throughout the afternoon.
Commissioner Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe says he's dismayed after a report found major failings in the way the force investigated allegations of historical child sex abuse involving VIPs. Operation Midland considered claims against a host of establishment figures, but the investigation was closed in March without any charges being brought. An independent review found numerous errors were made, and the decision to abandon the inquiry should have been taken much earlier. Kensington Palace says Prince Harry's girlfriend, Meghan Markle, has been subjected to a wave of abuse and harassment by the media. In a strongly worded statement, the palace said the prince has been disappointed at not being able to protect Ms Markle and calls on the press to reflect before any further damage is done. Well, here is that statement. It says that Prince Harry is worried about Ms Markle's safety and is deeply disappointed that he's not been able to protect her. It is not right that a few months into a relationship with him that Ms Markle should be subjected to such a storm. It goes on, he knows commentators will say that this is the price she has to pay and that this is all part of the game. He strongly disagrees. This is not a game. It is her life and his. Scottish officials are going to court to try to force the Prime Minister to hold a Commons vote on Brexit. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said it simply cannot be right that rights linked to EU membership can be removed without parliamentary debate, scrutiny or consent. British banker Rurik Jutting has been jailed for life for murdering 2 Indonesian women in Hong Kong. In a series of videos recorded on his mobile phone, the Cambridge University graduate described torturing and killing his 2 victims in 2014. The Metropolitan Police has been strongly criticised in a report into its investigation of allegations of historical child sex abuse involving VIPs. The report found 43 errors, among them that the police were wrong to believe that one complainant, who was referred to as Nick, was credible for so long. They were also wrong to state publicly that the allegations were credible and true. They also used flawed and incomplete information to obtain search warrants. and they should also apparently have closed the investigation sooner. Well, let's talk now to retired Detective Superintendent Mike Hames. He's the former head of Scotland Yard's Obscene Publications branch. This should have been investigated earlier, shouldn't it? It should have been stopped earlier.
It should have been stopped a hell of a long time ago. It was clear to most people outside the bubble of Scotland Yard that there was absolutely no reason to carry it on. And one wonders why they did that.
Why do you think they did?
Well, I think that very often the police are frightened. They're frightened of being criticised. So they think they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. But what it really required was a more robust leadership at Scotland Yard, such that it should have been reviewed far earlier, and somebody should have said, enough's enough, there's nothing in it, and to just conclude the investigation at a far earlier stage, and signed it. And that's, I think, the problem, that the police do not have sufficient guts to actually say, look, there's nothing here. Because all you need to say is, look, we've looked at it, we've investigated it so far, as it stands, there's nothing in it, but we'll close it, and if something else comes up, obviously we'll reopen it. And all the things that they did wrong, I mean, for example, the way in which the detective superintendent said that the story was credible and true. Well, can you imagine if it had got to court what the defence would have said? I mean, they'd say quite rightly, well, look, you know, halfway through the inquiry, you'd said it was true. Therefore, you'd been working towards a conviction all the time instead of looking at both sides of the argument. So there were numerous problems involved in that whole inquiry. And I understand that the report itself is 90% redacted. So only 10% of the report has actually been published, which means nothing's been published, apart from some headline comments.
How hard, though, is it as a police officer to interview somebody like this person that's being referred to as Nick to keep his anonymity? Many people who are abused come from very chaotic backgrounds, don't they? And often the reason that people are abused is they're chosen by people who prey on them because they know that they're the kind of person who won't be believed, who possibly isn't very good at putting together a coherent argument, and that actually the authorities won't believe. How hard is it then for the police officers when somebody like Nick comes into their lives and has these stories to know whether or not they're lying or telling the truth?
Well, it appears that this man, although we only know him as Nick, is well-spoken, he's articulate, he holds down a good job, and so he was believable. You know, what he said seemed to make sense. But it clearly didn't make sense. And if the police had looked more closely at him, his background, his associations, his history, they would have quickly found out that he had in fact said things before, made false allegations before. And for example, another thing, they accused Ted Heath of being involved in murder and mayhem at Orphan Square. But Ted Heath was never more than about 6 foot away from his protection officer. He was protected all the time. So I would have sent somebody out to see the protection officers and pulled their diaries and say, okay, where was he on these days, these months? Where, you know, and actually look at it. And was he even in the country? I mean, apparently as well, Lord Bramall wasn't even in the UK at the time that these things were said to have happened. So it was a mess from start to finish.
Indeed. Well, that seems to be the conclusion that we've heard so far from this report following Sir Richard Henriques' review. Mike Hames, good to talk to you. Thank you.
Abuse to be in a special category to everybody else, i.e. murderers, rapists, robbers. If it's one rule for those accused of abuse and another rule for everybody else, I think that's wrong.
I know one of the questions that you've been asking yourself is, will anything in this put victims off coming forward? And now that you've seen, you say not all of the detail, but some of the detail, what's your answer to that?
Unfortunately, I think it will. Individuals who have been abused are very vulnerable and very mistrustful of authority, and any question that they're at fault, and this is what this report will suggest, will discourage them from coming forward. And it takes great courage over many years for them to make a disclosure. And I feel, unfortunately, this is a backward step.
Peter Garsden there speaking a little bit earlier on. Well, meanwhile, today the former head of the child abuse inquiry has said she won't appear before MPs to give evidence about her handling of the controversy, the inquiry that's been so hit by controversy. Dame Lowell Goddard resigned as head of the independent inquiry into child sex abuse back in August after 18 months in the role. She's gone back to New Zealand, but she's been accused of making racist remarks while she was chair, and a claim that she has denied. Let's get the latest on that from our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, who's at Westminster. And so, Norman, she's not wanting to come back and give evidence, and the committee are hopping mad, aren't they?
Well, there's no apology, no explanation, just a blunt refusal, frankly, from Dame Lowell Goddard to give evidence to the committee. She says because she's under no obligation to engage with them. She fears that were she to do so, it would perpetuate what she says are false allegations about her. She says she's already written to the committee, and she's angry at the government for not doing more when she was chairman of the child abuse inquiry to defend her, a response which has incensed the Labour chairwoman of the committee, Yvette Cooper.
Well, I think it's a disgraceful response from Dame Lowell Goddard. She has been a very highly paid public servant in charge of an extremely important inquiry into historic child abuse, and one where there are survivors of child abuse across the country who are relying on it to do a good job. The inquiry has clearly faced all sorts of difficulties over the last 18 months, culminating in the resignation of the third chair. And I think there has to be some transparency about how this has happened, about the things that have gone wrong. Otherwise, how can people be confident that the inquiry is back on the right track now?
Well, I'm joined by the Conservative committee member Tim Lawton. Dame Lowell Goddard clearly feels she has done nothing wrong and has no need to explain. Is she justified?
Well, she can come in front of the committee and say that in person. Her response is really unhelpful, really obstructive, and frankly really arrogant as well. 3 times at least she has been asked to appear in front of our committee by the previous chairman, me as acting chairman, and now the new chairman. Each time she's written back to say she's more than happy to cooperate with the committee, but now she's refusing point blank to come in front of us, answer our questions and explain for the very serious charges and claims she's made about the way the inquiry was being run. Frankly, it's not good enough, and it's an affront to this House and a very important inquiry that's been going on for the last couple of years and needs to get on with its work unencumbered by these problems overhanging it.
But is there anything actually that Parliament can do? I see Yvette Cooper has suggested if she sets foot in Britain again, she'll be summoned before Parliament. Really? Will anything happen?
Well, technically, we have powers to summon witnesses in front of select committees as long as they are in the UK. Within days of her tendering her resignation, without much explanation, she'd scarpered back to New Zealand, having pocketed many hundreds of thousands of pounds from the British taxpayer for running a very important inquiry. Her sudden departure undermined that inquiry. Serious questions have been raised. She's only added to those questions, and for the well-being of this inquiry to get on with its important work, as she says she wants, she needs to answer these questions and put some of these allegations and rumours to rest. And it's really disappointing and unhelpful if she's not going to do that.
Is there any role for government to get involved? After all, the Prime Minister appointed Dame Lowell Goddard. She set up the inquiry. Is there any scope for her to intervene directly?
Well, she is an ex-chairman of the inquiry. The scope and the remit of the Home Secretary is to appoint or to dismiss the head of the inquiry and to agree to the terms of reference. The problem is, beyond that, it is an independent inquiry. It's important it's independent, but it's also important that Parliament has a role, the Home Secretary has a role, when we have problems about the way it's being conducted by the chairman, and we need explanations that taxpayers' money is being spent for the purpose for which it's intended. And those questions are still outstanding, and she, above all, can answer those questions.
Tim Lawton, thanks very much for your time. I should tell you, Downing Street are resolutely saying they will not become directly involved because they say it is an independent inquiry and independent of government.
All right, Norman, thank you. Norman Smith there, our assistant political editor.
Hello, good afternoon and welcome to BBC News. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, has apologised for serious failings in Scotland Yard's investigation into an alleged paedophile ring at Westminster. A report by the retired judge, Sir Richard Henriques, said there were 43 errors in the way the allegations were examined. No charges emerged from the investigations, and a separate inquiry is now taking place into claims that a complainant in the case tried to pervert the course of justice. Sir Bernard has released a statement. It reads, "I asked for this independent review because I wanted to know if mistakes were made in investigations. It is a matter of professional and personal dismay that the suspects in the investigation were pursued for so long when it could have been concluded much earlier. They have all suffered," he says, "as a result of the investigation, and our description of the allegations is credible and true. We should not have said this, and we should have tested the credibility of the complainant more rigorously before conducting the searches." His statement goes on, "I cannot and I do not expect sympathy from the suspects in these cases, but it's necessary to understand pressure on investigators at the time. I accept accountability for failures identified within Operation Midland and Operation Vincente on behalf of the Metropolitan Police." Our correspondent Angus Crawford joins me now. Angus, I was reading through a response from the charity, the NSPCC, a little earlier to all of this, and it says, "It makes very difficult reading, this report, for the Metropolitan Police, who, despite good intentions at the outset, failed to admit they had got it wrong when it became clear that the allegations were unfounded." Well, now they are admitting that they got it wrong, but one wonders how so many mistakes, 43 of them, built up in the course of this investigation.
I think in two words, poor judgment. Those are the words that ring out from this particular inquiry into the conduct of Operation Midland. And it seems that, as you said, there were 43 separate failings within this inquiry, an extraordinary number. As a result, 5 officers are being referred to the Independent Police Complaints Commission. But it appears that of the 43, 4 were absolutely fatal. First of all, the officers at the very beginning believed one of the complainants, who we only know as Nick, they believed he was credible for far too long. They didn't test his evidence enough. Secondly, that, as you said earlier, in December 2014, only a month after it had been launched, officers described Nick's accusations as credible and true. That was something they should not have done at that time. A third one, which has slightly gone under the radar in terms of this inquiry, which is as equally difficult for the Met, is that according to the judge, they obtained search warrants to search properties using flawed and incomplete evidence, which means they deliberately misled a judge. Nothing could be more serious than that, which is absolutely extraordinary. So that is potentially more than poor judgment. The judge, Sir Richard Henriques, did say that the officers who'd carried out these inquiries did them honestly and did them with probity, but this clearly speaks to their competence in an extraordinary way. And finally, I think the key point after all of this is that this investigation should have been closed down much earlier.
And I suppose if we've learned anything in all of this, if you take Savile, Operation Newtree, Operation Midland, if you take all of that as a totality, it's the importance of getting a balance between listening to those who say they are victims of abuse and listening to those who are accused, some of them falsely, by individuals. And it seems it's very hard to get a balance here, because we have advocates for people who have been abused saying in response to this that they are concerned that it may put victims off coming forward.
Which is a real and present danger and problem. But I think Sir Richard Henriques goes some way towards addressing that. He makes 2 important recommendations. The first is that victims should be referred to as complainants, and that their information, their evidence, should be tested strongly so we never get to this position again. And secondly, that suspects should have anonymity until they are arrested. Clearly, in this case, none of them were arrested, none of them were charged, and yet all of this information was out in the public domain before they could reply. One final point, which I think is very interesting. Harvey Proctor, one of those who was implicated and now completely exonerated, has written a letter to the Met Police Commission. He has said, quite simply, "I hope this travesty will never occur again."
OK, Angus, thank you very much. Angus Crawford.
Well, in the wake of this, the Independent Police Complaints Commission has also released a statement this afternoon. Its deputy chair says, "We were advised earlier today that the Metropolitan Police is to refer the conduct of 5 officers ranging in rank from sergeant to deputy assistant commissioner to the Independent Police Complaints Commission in relation to Operation Midland. We have assembled an assessment team to analyse relevant documentation to be supplied by the force and provide me with a recommendation. Once I receive that recommendation, I will decide whether there will be an investigation." That's from the IPCC. Well, we can talk now to Sir Peter Fahey, the former Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, now the Chief Executive of the children's charity Retrack. Sir Peter, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Really damning criticism, devastating criticism of the Met's handling of all of this. What do you make of it?
Yes, it is very serious criticism, and that will be investigated by the Independent Police Complaints Commission. But I think clearly the worry is, and your commentator said it just now, is how do you get a balance? And I think the fear will be that the pendulum keeps on swinging. There are other police forces being investigated because they didn't actually believe victims of abuse. The Met will be investigated because they believed it too readily. And I think the concern has got to be the way the pendulum swings back and forward. What we know about these sorts of crimes, that they often happen in secret. The abusers put fear into the victims to make sure they don't speak out, and often it's very difficult to find supporting evidence. So what we can't get away from is that these are really difficult cases to actually investigate, and there are huge numbers of victims who are not seeing justice.
So you sympathise with the officers who were working on Operation Midland, do you?
Well, I think the public will sympathise with individual police officers trying to make sense in these situations, because in my experience, for instance, 2 detectives can investigate or interview a suspect or a witness, and one can believe they're telling the truth and the other one believe they're telling lies. So often this is a matter of very fine judgment. Clearly what was also in the background of the Operation Midland case was a long-standing accusation, not only that the police weren't treating abuse seriously, but also that there was a cover-up of rich and powerful people, particularly at Westminster, and that allegation had been around for many, many years. And clearly the allegation is now that that has clouded the judgment of those officers. That will have to be investigated. But as I say, the wider concern is really about the whole way that these sorts of crimes are investigated. And clearly it's awful when there are people wrongly accused, but also it's dreadful that there are so many victims of child abuse that I feel they are not able to get justice. And the fear was that they will be more reluctant now to come forward.
I mean, it was flawed judgment in the end, wasn't it? This really trusting this one source, this one complainant that Operation Midland was based on, Nick, the man known as Nick. The officers were really just too overzealous, perhaps, in the end.
Yes, that's what's been said, but obviously there are lots of other cases where the police have been accused of too readily questioning the version of a victim. And it comes back to this is a very fine judgment, and obviously it's said that that evidence has to be tested. Again, you will find in many, many cases it's very difficult to test the evidence because it's in the nature of this sort of crime, as I say, that it happens in secret. There is also already a relationship between these 2 people, and the allegation is that relationship has developed into abuse. So we can't get away that these are very, very difficult situations to investigate. And that's why I personally think one thing that needs to be looked at is a much wider system about how the legal system deals with these cases. In other jurisdictions and other countries, judges would be involved at a far earlier stage, or examining magistrates. And perhaps that needs to happen, is that judges and legally qualified people need to be involved at a far earlier stage of these sorts of investigations to decide whether they should proceed or not.
Sir Peter Fahey, former Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, thanks very much for being with us. Thank you.
Very good afternoon. We start with breaking news this afternoon. Police investigating allegations of an establishment paedophile ring that abused children during the 70s and 80s says they're actively looking into the possible murders of 3 young boys. The claims centre on a series of claims that child sex parties were held at a residential apartment complex in Dolphin Square in Westminster, which was popular with MPs and the security services at the time. Let's take a look at the key developments for you so far this afternoon. Detectives had already said they were investigating a homicide claim, but this lunchtime they went further, stating they were now looking into 3 possible murders. They're also looking at abuse at military bases in London and the home counties over the same period of time. And the officer leading the inquiry made an appeal for men who might have been abused and other potential witnesses to come forward. Scotland Yard detectives have just been briefing journalists on these latest developments. Tom Parmenter was among them, joins us now. 3 possible murders, Tom.
They are gravely serious allegations, and they are based on one witness called Nick. It's not his real name, but he's come forward to the police in the last couple of months and has given the police what they say as something they believe is a true and credible account of abuse at parties in London as a young boy, and also how he had information relating to 3 potential young boys being killed as part of that abuse. So deeply serious allegations, complex for the police to try to investigate it after so many years, but they say that they will go where the evidence takes them, wherever that may be. So Nick is one person who has given information to the police. Another is someone that we call Michael, who spoke to us first 3 years ago about being taken from his care homes in North Wales to be trafficked, bussed down to London to be abused by groups of powerful men. This week he has taken us to the area of London where he says he was abused. This is Michael's story.
As a young boy from a Welsh care home, the streets of Pimlico seemed like a different world back in the 1980s. Michael only saw these streets because he and other kids were bussed down here at weekends, plied with alcohol and sexually abused by powerful men. He knows it was here, but can't say exactly where.
Well, I know I've definitely been here before. When I was a kid, I brought down these streets. Could be any of these streets, but yeah, this is where the flat was. This is where we were brought as kids.
On the minibus from
North Wales. In that summer. It'll be covered up. Because MPs were involved, you know. Ministers were involved, cabinet ministers. I know they were. Even though to us they were kind of good days out, because we'd be taken to London afterwards, and you know, kind of spoiled. And when we were kids from North Wales, we'd never seen London and Regent's Park Zoo or Hyde Park or Big Ben and all that stuff. And we had to put up with some nonsense that some people did at night time, you know, in a flat.
We first heard from Michael 3 years ago, but this time he wanted to show us this area. He wanted to appear on camera. He doesn't want to hide like the men who abused him.
Part of me died here. Definitely. We thought they were doing us a massive favour by bringing us here. We felt special and being part of something. Didn't think it'd be a paedophile ring.
And how old were you, do you think, at this stage when they were bringing you down here?
11, 12 years old.
He's since been back on these streets with police officers trying to identify the property where he says the parties took place. But his health problems are stopping him from taking it further.
I just feel that as many people that are coming forward, as many people drop out. And I've got no faith in the Home Office or the government to protect us, you know, the victims, I guess.
It's a 5-minute walk from these streets to Dolphin Square by the River Thames. The police say they have another credible witness who has said he was abused at parties here. He's also prompted them to start a murder investigation, looking at claims 3 young boys were killed, although not necessarily at Dolphin Square. The complex has always been popular with politicians because it's a short walk from here to the Palace of Westminster. There are further allegations of abuse in Lambeth, Barnes, Islington and Richmond, but much of it can be linked back to Westminster. The government has started its independent inquiry, but still hasn't found somebody suitable to lead it.
I think there's something of a schism within the Cabinet in terms of the whole child abuse inquiry. I think the Prime Minister, and I don't say this lightly, but I think the Prime Minister is quite dismissive of the issue and wants to move on from it, whereas the Home Secretary, Theresa May, I think, is very serious about wanting to pursue this. She's right to say we're talking about the tip of the iceberg.
The Prime Minister has said he is fully committed to it and has promised to leave no stone unturned.
In a perfect world, these people will be caught by fingerprints or by, you know, CCTV and they can't, but it's going to be my word against theirs, and they're going to win hands down.
Sky News understands that arrests are inevitable in the new year. Whether they'll bring about justice for Michael is another matter. It all happened a long time ago, but they were 11, 12 or 13 years old. It was as wrong in the 1980s as it is today.
And today they're telling us, Tom, that the police, that they're investigating 3 potential murders. Do we know anything more about who these young boys might be?
As you can imagine, there were many more questions than the police were able to provide answers at the press briefing they gave here at East Scotland Yard this lunchtime. Of course, many people wanted to know exactly what were the circumstances of these deaths, how old were these boys, and exactly who they might be. But the police said, for quite understandable reasons, they can't go into those details at this stage, but they believe the account. They believe Nick, this witness that they have got into their investigation, who they say is credible, and that is why they are leading this murder investigation. Now, exactly where that goes and who it involves is one thing. The wider issue of these abuse parties that were going on where boys from care homes or from elsewhere were abused, that is also part of these police inquiries that are going on. I think where we are now is an unprecedented spot in relation to the government looking back at this, trying to give every commitment they possibly can to the survivors, those who suffered so much throughout this abuse for so many years afterwards, and also from the police today to say they will go where the evidence takes them, wherever that might be.
Okay, thank you.